Ukraine just pulled off one of the smartest and most brutal traps of the war, and Putin's tanks paid the price. Putin thought he had this in the bag. He threw 50,000 troops at Kursk, including 10,000 North Koreans, convinced it'd be an easy win. He was sure his unstoppable tanks would crush Ukraine's forces and make him look like a hero for taking back Russian land. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. Not even close. Instead, Ukraine saw him coming a mile away, literally, and set up a trap so devastating it left fields covered with burnt-out husks of Russian tanks. Russia's mighty counteroffensive? More like a total disaster. So how did Ukraine pull this off? And why does Putin keep falling for the same tricks? In this video, we're breaking down how Ukraine outsmarted Russia again, the massive losses Putin's forces suffered, and what this means for Kursk going forward. We start with the trap. For much of the Kursk counteroffensive, Russia has been trying to create a foothold for itself on the east side of the Snagost River. The goal is clear: squeeze out Ukraine's bridgehead in Kursk by stifling the route supplies take to the troops it's stationed in the region's north. And Russia has enjoyed some success with this approach. RBC Ukraine says that it's likely the Ukrainian units have withdrawn from fortified positions in Kursk's Olivsky Forest, with those soldiers moving back toward Mala Loknaya. They've also withdrawn from Deryino, which lies just beyond the Snagost River. But Russia wanted more. Putin's forces intended to capture every settlement they possibly could along the river, essentially creating a buffer zone to prevent Ukraine's troops from moving supplies through the north of Kursk. So far, Russia has failed in these attempts. The Snagost River serves as a natural barrier against Russia's forces, which is why Ukraine chose to fortify around it. And on the other side of that river sit soldiers in elevated positions who are able to see Russia coming and pick off troops and mechanized divisions. So Russia has found itself almost stalemated around the Snagost River. Putin wisely decided to change his approach. Rather than throwing soldiers at Ukrainian fortifications around the river, he switched to dedicating most of his soldiers to breaking through the front lines from the north in Tolsty Lug. The goal remains the same: cut off the Ukrainian supply lines running through the north of the territory it's claimed in Kursk. However, taking Tolsty Lug also means that Russia can conduct even more direct attacks against the Novoivanovka region to Kursk's east. That's a key position for Ukraine. Putin tried to take the settlement at the beginning of the Kursk counteroffensive. Those early attempts failed. Ukraine managed to withstand 5 waves of Russian attacks, inflicting heavy casualties on Russia in the process. Estimates suggest that at least 300 Russian and North Korean troops were killed or wounded in the 5 assaults leading up to November 11th. Ukraine also managed to destroy at least 18 of the 29 pieces of heavy equipment Putin deployed in these offensives, offering a hint that Ukraine was well prepared to spring the trap that it sprung in early December. Back to the December movements. Putin knew that taking Tolsty Lug would allow him to conduct attacks on Novoivanovka from 2 fronts, stretching Ukraine's forces in the region. So the initial Russian attack began. Euromaidan Press says that Russia sent several armored personnel carriers, or APCs, into a large water reservoir in the north of Tolsty Lug. Their goal was to bypass that reservoir, opening the door for more Russian forces to stream into the region so they could overwhelm Ukraine's forces. The problem for Putin was that Russia had attempted to use this route before during his early attempts to retake Novoivanovka. Ukraine knew he would try again. So it set up constant surveillance in the region using drones carrying thermal imaging equipment to serve as an early warning system throughout the reservoir region. That system was triggered when Putin sent his APCs and Ukraine got to work. Upon detecting the Russian vehicles, Ukraine launched a volley of Javelin anti-tank missiles at the convoy. The Javelin is a man-portable weapon system with an effective firing range of about 1.5 miles. Their missiles are equipped with high-explosive anti-tank, or HEAT, warheads that are capable of penetrating armored steel over 6 times the diameter of the warhead itself, perfect for taking out heavy machinery. Ukraine has used javelins to great effect to take out tanks on its territory during the war. This usage was no different. In minutes, the javelins had made short work of Russia's APCs, leaving the vehicles smoking on the ground. The few Russian soldiers who managed to escape the fiery wreckages of their vehicles attempted to escape into nearby trees, but Ukraine was prepared for that too. First-person view, or FPV drones, were also present around the reservoir. Ukraine used them to track down the soldiers who were now on foot, neutralizing them so that the first wave of Russia's offensive completely broke down. That sounds like a great trap, right? Only that wasn't Ukraine's anti-tank trap. It was just an example of how far ahead Ukraine's thinking is when it comes to anticipating Putin's troop movements. Ukraine would also have known that the purpose of this initial attempt to bypass the reservoir near Tolsty Lug was less about success for Russia and more about figuring out where Ukraine's firing positions were located. Russia now had that information. It sacrificed its APCs to work out where Ukraine would fire from and how quickly it would respond to an attack. Thinking that they knew what they were walking into, the Russian troops plowed forward. Several large waves, each containing between 6 and 10 armored vehicles, including tanks and fighting vehicles, attempted to push through. Those vehicles were accompanied by infantry units, with Russia's idea being to overwhelm what it thought were the only Ukrainian firing positions. It's a strategy that Putin has used constantly throughout the war. Figure out where the enemy is, and then just throw soldiers and equipment at the position until their lines are penetrated and they're either destroyed or forced to retreat. The problem is that Ukraine has seen this time and time again. And it was ready. Long before Russia sent its APCs into the reservoir to work out where Ukraine's firing positions were, Ukraine had mined the fields surrounding that key position extensively. As soon as the Russian forces discovered those mines, they saw they couldn't simply circumvent Ukraine's firing positions. Doing so would mean driving their tanks over fields filled with explosives that would destroy their mechanized convoys before they get close to Ukraine. So the Russian waves of tanks had no choice but to follow the singular route Ukraine had created for them, a route that took those tanks directly through a region where they didn't want to be. And the trap was sprung. Several of the Russian vehicles and tanks were immobilized on Dragon's Teeth that Ukraine had set up on the only road Russia was able to travel. Ever since World War II, these small concrete pyramids have stopped tanks in their tracks, leaving them open for counterattacks. The Ukraine war has showed us that Putin still has an antiquated view of ground warfare in many respects. He relies on trenches and tanks to take positions. By using mines to force Russia's tanks to take the route it wanted them to take, Ukraine was able to lead many of them directly onto Dragon's Teeth, immobilizing them and removing their threat. The few tanks that managed to navigate the Dragon's Teeth had other problems. They were out in the open and directly in the sights of Ukraine's firing lines. Each wave Russia sent was met with artillery strikes, javelin missiles, and FPV drone assaults, and the tanks just kept coming. Mechanized assault after mechanized assault fell victim to the same trap, suggesting that the Russian soldiers simply had no clue what to do. Retreat wasn't an option. All the tanks could do was attempt to push forward, while troops from Ukraine's 225th Assault Battalion and 36th Marine Brigade pelted them with munitions. Images from the battlefield published on social media platforms show the extent of the damage. Entire fields are cluttered with the burnt-out shells of tanks and armored vehicles throughout Tolstoy Lug, Nizhny Klin, and Zeleny Shlyak. Some of the tanks were victims of Ukraine's cleverly placed mines. Russia thought it had outsmarted Ukraine by identifying its firing positions and attempting to circumvent them via the surrounding fields. Each tank that went up in flames following the explosion of a mine revealed that Ukraine knew exactly what Putin's forces were up to long before they even sent in the first APC wave. Other tanks lie immobile on Dragon's Teeth, not destroyed but still abandoned by their crews, and more fell victim to javelin and artillery fire, being turned into smoking husks while trapped in a firing line that Ukraine brilliantly tricked them into following. Euromaidan describes the scene as a graveyard of tanks and other armored vehicles. There can be no more accurate description. Putin's forces were humiliated in their attempt to bypass the reservoir near Tolstoy Lug. They're still no closer to taking Novoivanovka, and Putin is going to be forced to rethink his strategy once more. The odds are that he'll just land on throwing more soldiers and equipment at the Ukrainian positions, because if he's shown us nothing else during this special military operation, it's that he's willing to sacrifice his soldiers to get what he wants. All of this was a bad enough humiliation for Russia, but it gets worse. Russia is still trying to push through to Novoivanovka. The difference now is that it's trying to rely on pure infantry assaults, according to Ukraine's 24th Assault Battalion. Russia's armor, its tanks and fighting vehicles were destroyed so quickly by Ukraine's trap that it doesn't have any left to restock its troops. The 24th Assault Battalion believes that the few reserves Russia has in its warehouse in Kursk have now been exhausted. Putin's only strategy now is to throw soldiers at the Ukrainian positions on foot. That isn't going to work. Ukraine has already shown how easily it can pick off the soldiers who escape their flaming vehicles using FPV drones. The Russian soldiers who are trying to break through on foot now are little more than sitting ducks for a Ukraine that was more than ready for the predictable tactics Putin would use to try and take Novoivanovka. Right now, Vladimir Putin and his cronies are trying to figure out what went wrong in Tolstoy Lug. We have some answers. Russia's first problem was that it completely underestimated Ukraine's strength around the Tolstoy Lug region. That shouldn't have happened. Putin had tried to push through the region before. His assaults leading up to the November 11th failure showed us that. And Ukraine had an inkling that he would try to do it again. That inkling led to Ukraine setting up its FPV drones to surveil the area, meaning it saw Russia's APCs coming, and with the APCs came the likelihood of waves of mechanized units to follow. For some reason, Putin seemed to think that he could try the same thing that had failed weeks before and achieve better results. He didn't seem to realize that Ukraine would use the weeks between November 11th and the beginning of December to further fortify its positions around Novoivanovka in preparation for another assault. Russia's approach has become too predictable, and that's been a problem for Putin for over a decade and a half at this point. As European Security and Defense points out, Putin has been making the same mistakes in Ukraine that he made during his ill-fated attempt to invade Georgia in 2008. That conflict, sometimes mockingly referred to as the 5-Day War because of its brevity, saw Russia attempt to invade Georgia with poorly trained conscripts who lacked the proper training for a ground offensive. It also exposed a raft of technical issues in Russia's military. Its communication systems were so antiquated that they were easy prey for Georgia's electronic warfare tactics. The country's equipment was also in poor repair, with far too much of it breaking down and becoming unusable during Russia's march into Georgia. Once Russia finally arrived into Georgia, its troops were exhausted and the Georgians were ready for them. Over the course of 5 days, Georgia destroyed, damaged, or captured 93 pieces of Russian military equipment, including 4 tanks, 21 infantry fighting vehicles, and 8 aircraft. Logistics were poor, rear support barely existed. Russia basically went into Georgia, feeling that it could steamroll the country using manpower and larger equipment numbers, only for that strategy to fall flat on its face. Does that sound familiar? Despite the Russian armed forces supposedly undergoing extensive reforms in the wake of the Georgia debacle, not a lot has changed in the country's approach now that it's fighting Ukraine. It's still sending poorly trained conscripts to the front lines to get them torn up by its enemy's guns and artillery. Equipment breakdowns are as common as they ever were, and Putin has shown that his tactical nous extends to sending in tanks and troops while relying on better numbers to overwhelm positions. It's all so predictable. And it's this predictability that allowed Ukraine to spring its anti-tank trap. It knew exactly what Russia was going to try, because it had both tried it before and had consistently failed to evolve its tactics during nearly 3 years of war. The Tolstoy Lug tank trap is just one of many examples of Ukraine cleverly predicting what Russia will do next. But there are a lot of other reasons Russia lost. Ukraine's understanding of layered defense also played a massive role. Euromaidan says that Ukraine's use of layered defenses played a huge role in allowing it to successfully spring its trap against Russia. You've seen how this defensive strategy works in our recounting of the incident. The Javelins and FPV drones Ukraine used when Russia sent in its APCs acted as the first layer. The mines planted in the field were the second, with the Dragon's teeth lining the path that Ukraine forced Russia to take being the third. Then there was another layer, more drones and Javelins along with artillery. A December 2022 article published in the Defense Post highlights that this layered defense is nothing new for Ukraine. When tackling Russia's own drones, Ukraine relies on combining aircraft and drone patrols with ground-based anti-air missiles and small units of soldiers on the ground. You'll see plenty of parallels with its approach to the Russian tanks in Tolstoy Lug here. Ukraine doesn't rely on a single form of defense to block Russian advantages. It creates several, often using them in stages to force Russia to act in the way that Ukraine wants it to act. It's very intelligent defending. And the fact that Russia still doesn't seem to be able to figure it out tells us a lot about Putin's tactical ineptitude. As soon as the mechanized divisions trying to bypass the reservoir in Tolstoy Lug discovered the mines in the field, they should have known that Ukraine was leading them into a trap. A retreat and regrouping should have followed, with Russia coming up with an alternative way to assault Novoivanovka, even if that meant losing a few tanks to Javelin strikes during the escape. But no, Russia kept moving forward into the next layer and then the next, and then its tanks were decimated as a result. Putin's mistake here is that he just doesn't learn. Coupled with his failures to adapt his tactics, you get a 1-2 punch of strategic fragility that allowed Ukraine to set its trap. Then there's the equipment problem, another massive blunder on Russia's part. Russia's forces are now trying to break through to Novoivanovka on foot, telling us that something's gone wrong with the supply lines that are supposed to be feeding them the tanks and armored vehicles they need for the assaults. What's gone wrong is simple: Russia is running out of equipment. Forbes also reported on Ukraine setting up what it dubbed a road of death on the road moving past Zeleny Shlyak. It's the road that Russia attempted to take into Novoivanovka. Forbes reported on a video that shows at least 10 destroyed vehicles along the road, with the 225th Assault Battalion claiming that the fields are mined, the road is targeted by our artillery, and every movement is carefully monitored. Forbes reports that Putin is sticking to the same strategy of constantly attacking down the road near Zeleny Shlyak, and the tale the images from the Road of Death tell is of a Russia that's running out of equipment. During the initial assaults in October and into early November, Russia used BTR-82 infantry fighting vehicles. Apparently, soldiers on the front lines in Kursk received at least 40 of those vehicles. Fast forward to December, and those BTR-82s are running out. The new wreckages on the Road of Death appear to be BMP and BMD tracked fighting vehicles, a definite downgrade from the BTR-82, along with some armored tractors and Buran trucks. It won't be long before these weaker vehicles will disappear too, forcing Russia into relying on whatever makeshift mechanized units it can provide to its soldiers, assuming it sends any at all. Just a quick reminder, this is Russia fighting in its own country. It looks like Putin is either running out of armored vehicles inside Russia, or he's done such a bad job of setting up logistics that the vehicles Russia does have aren't getting to the soldiers who need them. Things are getting so bad for Russia that it's being forced to use trucks in place of tanks, and when those trucks run out, it's sending soldiers on foot. Between August 6th and November 26th, Russia lost 364 units of heavy equipment, ranging from tanks to trucks. With the Tolstoy Lug trap sprung, it's just lost dozens more of those vital pieces of equipment. So what does all of this mean for Ukraine's attempts to defend Kursk? On the one hand, Russia is enjoying some success. It's managed to take back about 40% of the territory Ukraine claimed during its initial incursion. Having 50,000 soldiers versus 20,000 is an advantage there. Putin's meat grinder tactics have worked to a point. But on the other hand, Tolstoy Lug shows us that Russia still hasn't figured out how to attack the most fortified positions Ukraine has in Kursk. Instead, it's just trying to batter them down with tanks and infantry, with both falling prey to Ukraine's layered defenses and superior tactics. Will Ukraine manage to repel Russia's counteroffensive? That remains to be seen, but what we can tell from this one incident is that Ukraine is outsmarting Russia every step of the way. If Russia manages to retake Kursk, it'll do so at the cost of tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of units of heavy equipment. A Pyrrhic victory, if there ever was one, for a nation that's already struggling with manpower and equipment problems. But what do you think about the trap that Ukraine sprung in Tolstoy Lug? Will Ukraine be able to keep using traps like these to keep Russia's soldiers at bay? Or is it only a matter of time before Putin has sacrificed enough troops and equipment to break down the Ukrainians' layered defenses? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching this video.